We are live, I believe. Thank you for joining me, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.
We know who to blame for this, right? This was Jonathan Shannon's fault for continuously bugging us with HTTP questions on Twitter and Skype and whatnot. So rather than...
We're supposed to call this the Glenn Miller Hour, by the way.
Well, that's why it's called In the Mood for HTTP. There's a reason for everything. Yeah, so rather than chopping our answers up into 140 character chunks, I figured that a little higher bandwidth option would be more appreciated. And we seem to have a wide range of questions, some of them seeded by us and some of them by people who have showed up. We currently have 35 people here, so that is an awesome turnout.
Yes, welcome.
And feel free to add new questions and upvote other questions that you would like answering whilst we go through here. Looks like we're going to do 30 to 40 minutes on this talk. And if it goes well and people like it, maybe we'll even do it again.
Who knows?
So, first question, Glenn?
Are there fundamental differences to consider when it comes to internal HTTP requests between microservices versus a public API? Well, first we have to talk about what microservices are. No, let's not actually go down that road. It's a service! I mean, the only thing I think that's different is the consumer. When you're talking about internal communication, your constraints may be different. You know, when you're creating a public API, you have a really large number of clients that are going to be consuming, and your API becomes kind of like your UI. I think when you're doing internal system communication, you have a lot more flexibility and a lot less constraints. It doesn't have to look pretty, to be honest, right? When you're doing a public API, you're really going to think a lot about, hey, I want to pull this person in, I want to make sure they want to use it, and you may go through a lot of great lengths to really validate that the API feels right, this, that, and the other. I would say one big difference would be that you don't have to worry as much about that. Another big difference would be chattiness. When you're talking about public APIs, you have to worry a lot about how chatty those APIs are, and you really need to think about different networks, edge networks, etc. What's that experience going to be like? Internal APIs can be pretty chatty. I mean, depending on if there's, especially if they're running like very close to each other, the chattiness may not really matter. Those are just a couple of thoughts I had off mine.
I think from a theory point of view, there's absolutely no difference, right? HTTP is HTTP, right?
Agreed.
But there are characteristics of requests that go backwards and forwards within a company that are often different. There are architectural differences internally versus externally, and I think it's those architectural differences that change it. Like you said, chattiness. Like in an internal system, you might be having two systems that are sitting in exactly the same data center that are talking to each other, and that changes the characteristics of the API. But then again, you may have companies that are global, and they may be communicating with other facilities that are at the other end. So the same constraints can apply, I think, both to internal and external. I mean, you get throttling and rate limiting, right? Obviously, that's going to be something that's a concern with a public API. Many times it won't be with internal, but you can also have I've seen enterprises with cross-department billing and that kind of thing. So in theory, you could run into all the same issues.
Yeah, this goes back to the magical "it depends," right? which we always like to say. So everything you hear on this call is on this show is probably going to have "it depends" prefixed to it,
unless we can quote an RFC. Right?
True.
At which point, then it's not. It depends, but it's not our fault.
Like get should always be idempotent. And safe. That's not going to be an "it depends."
Can we not discuss what is a side effect?
Fair enough.
Yeah, so I don't think the differentiator is internal versus external. I think the differentiator is how many clients do we have, and do we need to control volume? And I think the usual analysis that you do on an HTTP service, all the same questions need to be asked, whether or not it is internal or external. So comment, Troy, if you don't like our answer.
I mostly agree. I mean, I do think, no, I mean, I having worked on lots of internal services, I do think, maybe rightly or wrongly, but the bar tends to be lower.
Right. You don't have
the
the
supportability.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is a difference that way. But I agree with you that you still have to go through the same thoughts. You might say, well, what's the experience going to be? And say, well, for this case, we don't really care that much. But you at least went through the thought process of thinking about all of the different checkboxes and whether you need to check them or not.
Yeah. So Troy asked that question. Thank you, Troy. If you have any objections to our answer, there's a little comment place. You can put a comment under there, and maybe we'll have time to revisit. Moving on. So I submitted the question, where should I put my API?
Who is this Daryl Miller guy? I kind of see his picture a couple of times.
What kind of stupid question is that? So where should we put? Where do you like putting your API keys when making requests, Glenn?
I put them in the header. I put them in a header.
Any particular header?
Well, recently I've been putting them in the authorization header. Yeah, I definitely don't like the idea. And we built an API recently that there was a question about putting it in the query string. Like, why shouldn't I just allow people to put it in the query string? And there's a reason why people want that, because there's a lot of systems out there that you can just give them a URL and they can talk to that system. And if those systems don't support the ability to set the header, that can be a problem. The danger of that, though, is anything that's in the query string is most likely going to get logged by lots of different types of servers that are out there. So, I mean, it may not be publicly, you can use HTTPS and things like that to have it encrypted, but there's still a possibility that it can get picked up, like by proxy, other types of servers. So that's why I prefer to have it be in the header. And in actuality, I mean, the token or an API key really is a form of authentication. It's not a username and password, but it's basically a way to give you access to a system. So that's
an authorization, right?
Exactly. So I prefer it to be in the authorization header.
Right. Yeah. I think one place where you don't really have any choice is if you want to send a link to somebody in an email and you want them to be able to click on a link, right? But as you said, now that key is it's visible in the email potentially. It's archived. Obviously, you don't want to do that if it's an API key to some API that's built on usage, and you're concerned about it being exposed.
Well, it also means that the system would have to at least support that, meaning it would have to support allowing you to set the key in the query string. Like our API that we built won't allow you to do that anyway. So even if you set it in yes.
Yeah, but we all know that you can stick some kind of front end in front of that, and you can remangle the request and take it out of the query and put it somewhere else.
Like Nginx or something like that.
Or some other API gateway type of system.
Some other type of gateway, sure. Yes. I have no idea which one.
I think some of the things worth mentioning about API keys, again, talking about gateways, and I actually complained about the Azure API gateway because they weren't using the auth header, and my question is, well, why aren't you using the auth header? You should always put it in the auth header. Yeah. And their argument was, yeah, but we want the auth header to be used for the backend system, and the API key is for the gateway, so it's a secondary authorization key. So you want to leave the authorization key available to be passed through to the backend.
Interesting.
So there are scenarios where it's difficult to put it directly in the auth key because it's already being used.
In that scenario, this goes to the custom header question, though. Which would be the lesser of two evils in that scenario? Would it be creating another header for that, which would be useful for passing that specific information, or would you just fall back and say, well, just throw it into the query string or put it into URI segment?
I wouldn't put it in the query string for caching. Because you're
same
taking the identifier.
So you would create a separate header. Did they create it? So did they for Azure? And I'm not familiar with that gateway. So they have a separate header.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder what Amazon has done with their gateway, if they've done a similar thing. Okay. Well, there you go, folks. So don't put it in the query string. Our recommendation: don't put
unless
it in
you have to.
Put it in the header. Yes, unless you have to, of course. There's a caveat there. There's no spec on that one that says it must be.
The other little thing to consider is if you put your key in the authorization header, then public caches will potentially treat your response a little bit differently. And heuristic-based caching will potentially go, oh, look, there's an auth header here, therefore I'm not going to cache this.
Cache it, yes, right? Sure.
If you want to allow a response to be cached that has an authorization header, you have to explicitly say public in the cache control header. Or for some reason, if you say must revalidate in the cache control header, that allows you to cache the response, even though there's an authorization header. And I've never figured out why the must revalidate has that effect, but apparently it does.
Interesting.
Yep.
I mean, that would be that becomes an interesting question too about caches, and because you can have public caches in general are not going to cache things that are secure or that have like you said that have the authorization header. But private caches can, right? Like even if you're using like
public caches could too. I mean, consider something that's going and getting stock market data, right? And you're using a key that you want to go get that stock market data. You could have multiple people all making a request for that same stock market data. As long as they have an auth key to say they can,
right?
Then why not pull it from the cache instead of going? I mean, obviously you don't want it to be cached for too long, or it becomes out of date. But
actually, I know what I was thinking about. I was thinking more about HTTPS. If you're using HTTPS, public caches are not going to cache those responses. Is that true?
You know what? I don't know. I think, but you probably do the caching behind the HTTPS.
That's
anyway,
my point.
Right?
That's my point. No, that was what I was bringing in the conversation. That you've got caches that live at multiple levels, and although because HTTPS is encrypted, I believe you're not going to have any public caches that will pick that up, but it's very possible that you'll have like an edge cache or something on your network that will cache it.
Right. Yep. Cool. And I'm sure I may have seeded the questions with some other caching related questions.
I'm kind of getting that sense.
Let's flip it around and not answer the next question directly.
Yeah, let's jump down to
7 votes.
Let's jump down to Cecil's question.
This
Darrell Miller guy is pretty active, but
okay. Well, we'll leave that. Even though it has 7 votes, we'll do Cecil's first.
It has 7 votes, but let's just this Darrell guy is going to get a lot of play. So let's jump to Cecil's question. So why don't you read that one, Darrell?
What are our suggestions for HTTP API discoverability? Well,
very interesting.
I actually got into a little bit of trouble a few weeks ago because I wrote a blog post talking about discoverability, and I got told I was wrong by both Mike Amundsen and John Sheehan. And they both told me that my definition of discoverability was wrong, and they came up with 2 different definitions of discoverability. So then I wrote another blog post explaining the 3 different levels of discoverability, right?
Which I've not read yet. Now I feel bad.
So this was my take on discoverability insofar as, before we talk about how to do it, as what are the 3 different levels, and I'll see if I can remember them without having to go and pull up my blog post. There's I need to do currency exchange. So I really need an API that does currency exchange. Where am I going to find a currency exchange API?
This is kind of what the UDDI world was trying to do, though it never really worked out.
Right, and we now have APIsJSON.org or API Commons. I always get them mixed up. That is, I think
it's the APIs.json.
APIs.org.
Yeah.
That has a bunch of places where you can register Swagger documents that say these are APIs that do this particular functionality, right? So so now I've found my API that's going to do it. Now, where am I going to deploy? Okay. Maybe there's two different services. I use one currency exchange service, and everything's going fine, and then they go out of business. So I want to be able to switch in another one and just interchange. So my client code has to be able to, on the fly, change from discovering currency exchange service A to now using currency exchange service B, kind of like a provider model that we do in code, right? You can just swap one service out from another.
The interface is the same. The implementation is different.
Yes. And then the third level is more of a DevOps-y type thing, which is I've implemented a currency exchange service in my microservices infrastructure, and I'm currently running in a test environment. And how am I going to find out on what physical machine is my currency exchange service?
So I need a locator. Really, it's a locator in that world.
Yes. So those were the three different types of discoverability that I kind of, based on the feedback that I got, I kind of identified. My original premise was you can use hypermedia for discovering the location of a particular implementation. I know from the work that I was doing at RunScope, they have a special client, and they have a special URL that says, I would like to go and get the currency exchange, and in the client code, it knows how to look up and where to find that particular thing so that their DevOps infrastructure can move services around and not break clients. So that's another way of doing it without using embedded hypermedia.
So it has like a directory service almost.
Effectively, and that capability is built into the client. It's almost like an application level DNS, right? Because you could also sort of do it with DNS, right?
Sure.
You can do DNS entries.
Just use a fixed name, and then the clients just know to use that name, and then the machine is configured, or the DNS is configured to properly resolve the correct service instance.
Yeah, like we do with SMTP dot and pop dot and www dot, right?
Yep.
You can do that level of DNS. There's also the special type of DNS record, the SRV record, which is a service record, and you can actually do DNS queries to look up and say, I would like to get access to this particular type of service, and it will return you back a record that has a pointer to where that service lives.
Yeah, and an interesting thing I'm thinking about with this question, it'd be good to get maybe a little context from Cecil more on which one of the three you're talking about. My first guess is the sense is more like the first one. You know, being able. But I would
UDDI, right?
But I would also add into that describability. Like I think it kind of relates when people say discoverability. You know, and you mentioned like Swagger, and this often gets into not just how can I find an instance of a thing, but how can I understand how to use that thing and interact with it as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how do I know whether this is a currency exchange service? To know that I can use this one or this one, like how do I have an equivalent?
How do I describe it?
To know that it does the same job.
Yeah. Right, and that goes all the way to once I've identified one, how do I actually interact with it and use it? And there's been quite a lot of energy. I think the broader discoverability is still an area that is very amorphous. Like we haven't seen a lot done. Maybe we've been burned by UDDI. And so we've just been
No, I don't think. I think most of the Swagger developers have never heard of UDDI. Maybe that's
but there is you know, aside from like you mentioned like APIs.json, which is new and some interesting things happening there. But there's been quite a bit of energy around that describing aspect, describing what an API can actually do. And of course Swagger is one. that's
Did you say one or one?
One. Nice. Could maybe say both. It certainly is getting the from what I can see, getting the most traction. Definitely not the only player in town. I think Swagger caters to where most people are at, and that's probably, in terms of the kinds of APIs that they're building and their expectations around describability. So I think they've done a good job there in terms of meeting something that caters to the larger masses. But of course, there's lots of other interesting things that are happening, like Alps, for example, which is more of a description of kind of the message components that are present.
Yes.
And then we have the stuff that the API Airy guys are doing with blueprints.
Yep. And Waddle and Raml.
And we have Waddle and Raml. So this particular problem space is pretty rich. It still remains to be seen which one will be, and there's a need to be only one.
Yeah. Well, actually, little shout out to the guys at API Maddox. They've built a transformer that will transform between the different formats for you also.
Does that use like hyperschema or what? I know there's some work going on which might.
They have their own internal format that they convert everything to, and to do the transition between the different formats.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that's an online service.
All right, so hopefully we gave some answers there. I mean, we more, I think, spoke about some of the options. I think it's still a young space, but definitely things like Swagger are starting to gain a lot of traction.
I will just add one last comment about the discoverability. There is the other, which is the JSON Home document, right? So the JSON Home approaches it with a different perspective, right? The JSON Home is a runtime discoverable metadata format, whereas Swagger and Raml and API Blueprint are more design time tooling.
Yeah.
JSON Home is a draft spec that you put at the root of your API and points to other resources that are available, and it's intended to be consumed at runtime only.
Well, that's interesting too, in terms of going back to your blog post about the different levels of discoverability, because there's a discoverability once I actually am at the root. What can I do from here? What does this service offer? So that's almost like a fourth level in a way.
Yeah, that's right. And like, for example, GitHub do that at the root of their API, and they've just used their own custom format to say, look, here's a bunch of things that you can go and find, and here are the URI templates.
Yep, and we use that in the book as well, in our web API, in our shameless plug, our ASP.NET Web API book on evolvability.
We'll include links in the show notes.
We should have just called it Evolvable APIs. We would have had more people reading it than if we just. Okay, so moving on.
Look, we could talk for ages about the whole Swagger thing, and I see another question further down that's going to bring us back there. So let's just move on for the moment.
Yeah, let's go back up to this Daryl Miller guy who's got 8 votes on pros and cons of custom headers. Take it away, Daryl.
Okay. For better or for worse, I have no problem with people using custom headers. I think there is some data that belongs in the headers that shouldn't be in the body, is more advantageous to put in the headers, so it can be viewed by intermediaries, and as long as you pseudo namespace it with either your project dash or your company dash beforehand, I think it's perfectly fine way of adding metadata. I'd rather see you do that than add a wrapper around the payload of your body. I'd rather see metadata in the header. So the only caveat being, just don't do the X dash.
I was just going to ask that. I was going to say, what about X dash, which is still getting used quite a bit. We use it several places within our own APIs, actually.
So the history being X dash was meant to mean experimental. It means we're trying something out.
Yes.
And we should make sure that before anybody uses this in production, we fix it so it's not X dash anymore.
Right.
And that didn't happen because
Right.
people realized that as soon as they dropped the X dash, all the code that was dependent on it saying X dash is going to be broken. So X dash stay. So now people seem to look at it and go, no, it means extension. Well, that's not what it meant. It meant experiment.
Right.
So there is now actually.
So you would prefer that your recommendation would be that, hey, we use like a vendor name. Like in our case, we have X dash headers in some places in Splunk, and it'd be better to just call it Splunk dash as an example.
It's two extra redundant characters in
now, if you use X dash, what's going to happen? Are there going to be police that are going to show up at your door?
No. I mean, the theory being that all headers should be registered with IANA in and if you're designing a header that you think lots of people could take advantage of, then yeah, write up an internet draft and get it published and get people to comment on it, and maybe it can become a standard like they did with forwarded. Right? Instead of using X-forwarded for, somebody said, okay, this is silly. Let's actually write a spec up and explain what forwarded is. And they also added a little registry so you can do forwarded for different reasons and have different pieces of information. It's just about doing things properly, right? If, on the other hand, you have something that is within the scope of your particular application or your particular company, then go ahead, use, I mean, really, let's say you use it with your own vendor prefix, and it becomes really popular and it's a good idea, then it shouldn't be that hard to, at a later point in time, introduce a new standardized one, write up a spec, and submit a standardized one, right?
I mean, I think part of what happens, too, is people see X dash, so they see there's precedent, and say, oh, well, we'll just do X dash.
Yeah.
I saw that many times, even when I was at Microsoft. I saw the same kind of thing. Like, there's precedent, let's just use it. Not knowing whether or not, that it's perfectly acceptable to not use it, but still solve the problem. You're trying to solve a problem, which is you're trying to attach some type of additional metadata that doesn't belong in the body, doesn't belong in the URI.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move to another Daryl, and then we'll switch back. This Daryl guy's got a lot of good ideas, questions here. What should we return in the body from post or put?
Do you have any opinions? Because I've seen lots of people say you should do this and you shouldn't do that.
There's no rules, really. Like for a post, it's okay to have a status code that it's okay to not return anything, actually.
Yep, you can return a 204. Absolutely.
You can return a 204.
You can return a 201 with a location to where the thing is that you created and no more body.
Or a 202, right? You can return a 202, which says that it's accepted, and you return a link which one can use to check the status.
You can also return the new thing that you created,
absolutely,
a full representation, right?
And I've done that in particular when the server may modify the payload that you sent it, like add in an identifier, or there's no guarantee or there's no contract that says when you send data that the data you're going to get back cannot be an enriched form of the data that you sent.
Right. But there's let's talk about that around put, right? Because people get confused about that with put, right? I have this representation, and if you read 2616 casually, you would think that you're supposed to do a complete replacement. Right. Therefore, if you do a get, you're supposed to get back exactly what you put, right? That's the simplistic reading of it.
Right.
Which was, they've now tripled the explanation in the new RFC to say, no, it's a little bit more subtle than that. The server can make changes to it and add additional things into it, and it's still considered valid.
Yes.
I learned a new thing the other day. When I was reading the spec, I discovered that you can signal on a put by using an E tag in the header. If you return an E tag in the header, the client can look at that E tag and compare it to the E tag of what it sent, and know whether or not the server did any updates to it or not.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
I thought-
That's very
So
interesting. 'Cause
if
you
the
can,
tag changes, then it knows it should do a get to get back the updated
right.
representation. If it doesn't, if the tag doesn't change, then it knows the copy that it has in memory is the exact identical replica of what the server stored.
Right.
Is
And in general, you should never cache. This is an important thing: is you should not, unless you're using an HTTP GET, you shouldn't cache the response.
You cannot cache the response to put. But
Post. You're saying for a post you could.
you can cache the response to a post. You cannot return a cached response to a post request.
I see. So I could. Right. Okay. What you're
The
saying
only-
is the server cannot return a cached response because the whole nature of post is that anything can happen.
Right. But you
So
can do a post. Let's say you do post to add a new item to a collection.
But
And
a
for
cache,
speed reasons,
but a cache would not. Yeah, go ahead.
so for speed reasons, you want to return back that updated collection with that new item added into it. You can put caching headers on that, and that would be cached locally. And then when somebody does a get on that collection,
They'll
they would
the
get
cached version.
the cached
Good
version.
Good clarification. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the case of that put example, if it returned a modified tag, then and I had a local cache, I could basically cache that response that I got back from the put and associate it with that tag.
No, you're not
For a
allowed
get,
to
or
cache
no?
the response to. What you can do is you can invalidate the cache
current
copy.
one. The current
You
one.
have to do a get to get a new copy and cache it.
Awesome.
The only other one that you can do, you can get a cache response from, is a head. If you do a head request, you can get a cached response back. What I haven't figured out is whether or not, let's say you've done a get, you've got an entire response in a cache, and you do a head request, and the response is still fresh. Is the cache allowed to just return the header portions of the response? Or is the head response and the get response two completely different responses?
I see. Oh, that's interesting. Because what you're saying is that if a GET request contains a subset of what would be necessary for a head request. So would that be valid? That's pretty interesting.
It would make sense that you'd be able to do that, but I haven't actually found the text there.
I found the put discussion very interesting. I feel like you could almost have a podcast on the finer points of put. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Partial response.
Let's move on. Nobody asked about patch, but that would be another interesting discussion. Let's jump to Ryan, who has asked about browser client. So you've got a JavaScript client, which is calling a hypermedia API, versus code-on-demand AJAX calls. So by code-on-demand AJAX calls, I'm assuming what you mean here is that instead of the JavaScript client reading a hypermedia response, then it's dynamically just building up a request URI based on some logic that was pushed down from the server, and that's code-on-demand. So that's still valid from a kind of a REST perspective. Is that right, Ryan? Can you weigh in quickly as a comment on if that is the question that you're asking? Like, should you build a JavaScript client to navigate a hypermedia API, or should you just rely on the server updating the client? So one thing I would say is that only works in the cases where the server is actually generating the client. Like, in an API world, I might have a completely separate client, one web app that returns a client, and then it's calling out to some completely different API. As long as that server is able to generate script, I guess, potentially either one could work from a REST perspective, but I think that the difference would be if they're two separate servers. The advantage of a hypermedia API is it puts full control on the server to dictate to the client what URIs it can use.
But so does
Whereas
code on demand, right?
it
I
does,
mean, the
but
server's
imagine
delivering the code on demand.
it does, but imagine I'm doing cores. Okay, so I'm doing cross-origin resource sharing. I have server A, where I got the JavaScript client from. It's calling out to an API, which is server B. Now, sure, server A can change the URIs on the fly, but that removes control from server B, in a sense, because in the case of the hypermedia case, server B is going to be able to dictate exactly what those URIs are. Whereas to make that work, it could work, server A would have to somehow know how to get the updated URIs from server B so that those would get embedded into the client. For me, I'm having a hard time seeing what value I would have in doing that.
I'm going to say I don't have enough experience building apps in the browser to be able to make a distinction between those two approaches. I think I would love to read an article written by somebody who has done both, calling out the distinctions. I think it's an interesting distinction.
I'm not the master, but I have built lots of web apps working professionally. I would lean towards just using the Hypermedia API for the reasons that I said.
Yeah.
It's less plumbing. Like I'm not saying you can't make it work, and I think like like when the HTTP spec was, I mean, what the HTTP spec was really hitting on was this idea of clients being hard-coded. When your client is being dynamically generated all the time, you don't have that coupling like when you have, say, a WPF desktop application or Silverlight app, which Daryl you know pretty well, which gets hard-coded, and then to update it. I mean, even Silverlight is debatable, right? Because Silverlight it was delivering, even though it's a precompiled thing, kind of like a WPF app, it is being delivered dynamically on the fly. There's no guarantee. There's nothing saying that ZAP is not getting generated on the fly. So code on demand could apply there as well. But so I think there's the is it RESTful or not, which also gets into a big can of worms of does that matter? In terms of the problem that you're trying to solve, in terms of decoupling the clients from the URI space, I would personally, in that situation, I would just try to go with a Hypermedia API.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're coming close to our time limit here.
Yep.
Shall we try and sneak in one more question?
I think we should. Why don't you pick it out, Daryl, since I've been picking most of the questions.
I'm going to bail on the question talking about auto-arrest for client generation. I apologize. I know there's interest and people want us to get back into Swagger, but we don't have nearly enough time to. So.
Well, Jonathan asked if we're a teapot. Well, I don't know who he mentioned this to. I am not a teapot. I'm quite sure of the fact that I'm not a teapot. I don't know about Daryl, though. He might be a teapot.
No, I'm more of a coffee person than a tea person.
Okay.
Okay, so
go ahead.
So there's a topic okay, there was okay, here's a good question. What are your thoughts about having a get body? We can do this quickly, right? So we all know that the rules are a get can have a body, but you can't do anything with it, and it can't mean anything. So in all practical reasons, you can't have a get body.
Right. You can't expect that the server would have any expectation of what to do with a get body.
Right. So the question is, well, why would you want a get body, right? Well, most of the times that people want to have a get body is because they want to do a complex search.
Yes. Totally.
With a ton of parameters that are a pain in the butt to encode in the query string.
Yes, exactly right.
So that's usually where people run into it. So then the only option they have left is, well, let's use post. And the problem with using post is now the client's making the statement that I'm making a request that might be unsafe, when in reality we know that they're actually making a safe request.
Yes.
So that kind of sucks. Now, if you go wandering into GitHub and go to the HTTP-WG, the HTTP Working Group repo, you'll see some new specs that have been worked on, and one of them is a internet draft for a new method called search, which is a resurrected method from WebDAV, or from adjustment to WebDAV. So somebody is proposing, I believe this is James Snell from IBM, is proposing that we introduce a search. method. And the
So
search
this would
method,
have the semantics that would allow me to post, to equivalent to post. I could send to the body, but it would actually be idempotent and safe.
a safe request. Yeah, I suppose it's idempotent. Yes. Now, the downside to this, of course, is when you put it in the body, is it makes it tricky for caches to cache the result because they need to generate a cache key, and if you've got a giant body of parameters, you've got to somehow mush those up and put them as part of a cache key.
Well, it's also going to take 50 years for browsers to adopt it. Because, I mean, you could imagine some interesting form type things. I mean, maybe it would work. Yeah, because browsers can only do get and post in terms of, unless you use kind of the header.
We use Ajax type stuff, right? And you can get around that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we couldn't even get the browsers to accept put and delete. Okay, so there's no way they're going to accept new methods. But there are APIs served by other clients, so there's still a viable usage of it. So I think there is an absolutely viable reason why people want to do a get body, but it would be really nice to see a standardized alternate method that allows us to make a safe request. Now, there is one other workaround. You can do a post, and I ran into an RFC that describes a safe header. So it's a header that says this request is safe, even though it is a post.
But the server would have to understand that also.
Sure, and intermediaries would have to understand it. And most of them don't.
That's the challenge even with adding something like search, is that you can, I mean, it's great to see the process starting, but it would take a long time for it to fully
Sure. But if you're building an internal system,
right,
or you're building a client and an API, then you have control over it, right? The only question is, are there intermediaries out there that are going to strip it? Well, guess what? We're all moving to HTTPS anyway, because HTTP2 is worried about the exact same problem of proxies stripping stuff out that they don't understand. So it's all going to be binary encoded over the wire, encrypted in the HTTPS. So chances are it's going to get to your target anyway. So it makes it less scary to start using new methods once we start using HTTPS and specifically HTTP2.
Cool stuff.
So
all right, well, I think we have a lot of questions left.
Yes, we do.
To do potentially additional episodes. So let's thank you guys all for joining us. If you think we should do a round 2, let us know in the comments or tweet about it or whatever.
Yeah. And let us know about the time slot also, because we kind of picked this time slot arbitrarily. If another time slot would work better for people, we are open to considering it.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Danielle from Brown Bag Conf, for setting this up for us.
Thank you very much, Danielle.
And anybody who's listening who has topics that they'd like to discuss, then why not consider submitting your own brown bag? It's just a GitHub repo that you do a pull request to suggest your own session.
And we will keep these questions that have not been answered so that if, in the event, there is another, we will continue down the path.
Excellent.
Until next time.
Thank you very much.